We see a lot of headlines of peace agreements made, but rarely hear about the efforts made to bring about peace. Around the world, thousands of people are working behind the scenes to resolve violent conflicts and preserve peace. Whenever a conflict appears unsolvable and official diplomacy fails, David Gorman and his colleagues get on hand. With the United Nations often restrained by competing interests, the role of private peacemakers has received increasing attention in recent years. The Swiss-based Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, where Gorman works, is one of them. What can private peace brokers do in a world with currently more than 50 armed conflicts? Why can they accomplish something that governments or the UN cannot?
HD, the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue that I work with, was created in '99, but there had been other initiatives, mostly individuals, but some NGOs that had also been trying to work or working increasingly in this area. But I think that was sort of a period where it was recognized that there was a role and a need for non-state institutions to become more engaged, and they could and should become engaged in preventing and resolving violent conflict. So we were hived off from the International Committee for the Red Cross back in 1999. We're still technically known as the Center for Henry Dunant Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. And we were largely established to try to help fill in that gap, that perhaps the state institutions were not always seen as efficient, results-oriented, plagued by politics, maybe not always certainly impartial, being dominated by state-led interests, and that there was value in having an organization that, kind of like the International Committee for the Red Cross and other international humanitarian organizations, was not official, was not state-driven, was could operate outside, more effectively outside the public eye, and hence could be more creative. And so, in a way, we complement the official UN peacemaking mechanisms in other state, regional bodies, and what have you, by providing this format in which parties can come together outside of the state mechanisms in a way that sometimes might be more conducive or appealing to the parties, and might be a little bit more creative in some cases.
After working for more than 26 years on this kind of work, it is Gorman's job to be in between. He does not take sides, and he is not in cahoots with anyone.
Usually it's a matter of talking to the parties, and talking to those affected by the conflict, and talking to those who have a relationship with the parties, talking to the international community. So it's a lot of groundwork in meetings with people to try to get a sense of what is going on, what are the current dynamics, what is the need, if any, for dialogue or for negotiations, and where, if any, is there a need for the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue to come in to help out. So but often that process has many levels, starting with analysis and discussions, and then often a lot of trial and error. And for us to really build trust with parties, you have to demonstrate several qualities, and one of which would be to show that you are impartial, to show that you are effective at delivering messages clearly and clearly reflecting the other side's point of views, and able to articulate what this party is also saying to you and understand it, and to listen, and to demonstrate some results. So it's not just talking, but it's also helping put some of their issues into a format, into a process in which they can be more effectively resolved and addressed. And I think by demonstrating some of these results, by demonstrating a commitment, by demonstrating a degree of impartiality, that parties will begin to see you as a useful interlocutor to resolving the conflict and developing an effective process to do that.
Gorman trained as a mediator in Washington and went on his first mission to Israel at the age of 24. Ever since then, war zones or conflict scenes have been one of his homes.
Well, I've been involved in many. I was in Asia. I was in the Middle East. I started in the Middle East in Palestine, Israel, back in the mid-90s. And then I was Liberia, Sierra Leone for a couple of years. And then I was in Bosnia, and then 12 years in Southeast Asia, in the Philippines and Indonesia, but also helping the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue in its engagements in many other conflicts around the region. And now recently in Eurasia region, but also Latin America. We're drawn to trying to make a positive difference. And so I think we're never too sure when we start out in our early days what exactly that might mean operationally, what might be the organizations that might help facilitate that. Many times we just see the headlines, so we see that peace achieved and such, and we see the famous handshake. But that's really just the tip of the iceberg, and the 99.9% of the rest of it is all about the hard stuff that doesn't get the attention or the funding. And for me, being involved in this work is part of being a part of that whole operation. If we're going to be successful, you need to have all of those pieces lined up. So there's the political, but there's also the humanitarian, there's also the governance parts, there's the judicial, the legislative, the community involvement, and so on and so forth. And it's I think we've learned a little bit more, although we don't always get it quite right still, that you have to have all of these different parts to make something work. And so being a peace builder is being a part of that building of these blocks to sustain a peace.
Mediation and dialogue are the cheapest and most effective tools for preventing and resolving armed conflicts. That's the core approach the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue utilized to achieve their goals. Gorman believes that dialogue and mediation can actually change things.
I think that mediation does offer many tools to the parties that can help give the process a better chance, let's put it that way. So if they're willing to walk through that door, I think that the mediation community, particularly over the last 25 or 30 years or so, does have a wider range of understanding of how conflict can be solved, and a wider range of tools to try to help solve it. This doesn't mean it's a science yet, but I think it does mean that we have a lot more tools of the trade that might just help them, if they want to achieve success in resolving the conflict.
Peacemakers like Gorman are often tasked with dealing with the dirtiest acts of global society, facing stark challenges.
One is security. There's always an issue on that, particularly with some of us who are going out to the field, maybe without a clear mandate from the parties, and we're meeting with armed groups. We're going into dangerous areas. I think that's probably one of the issues and challenges that we face. Secondly, I think some of the ideological driven groups, there was certainly all of them have a certain degree of ideology, but with many of them you could sort of put it into a box and sort of say, okay, well, if maybe you can't get this ultimate goal of independence, but perhaps you could get things that help you further along in the sense of having a degree of local control or local governance or what have you. So there's a lot more to play with. Whereas with some of the groups, it's particularly now, it's much harder to have a conversation about finding a way to achieve their political ends in a way that might be something to compromise with. I think third is the issue of neutrality and how we're perceived, and we're often not perceived as being neutral. A lot of the previously held norms since World War II that have guided international institutions and diplomacy and states relationships, and many of the institutions that we've established since World War II that sort of kept the pieces loosely together, they no longer seem to have the credibility or respect that they might have had before. We are seeing, and maybe it's a good thing, or maybe will turn into a good thing, the regional institutions perhaps becoming more engaged in peacemaking, which would probably be more responsive to maybe some of the local, some of the more regional-based issues or what have you. But by and large, I think we see that there's a fraying of the role of the traditional international institutions and some of the values that they're sort of seen to be hold. And I think that makes it a little bit more challenging for all of us.
National and international efforts to prevent and resolve violent conflicts and support post-conflict recovery are often poorly informed by the views and experiences of ordinary people directly affected by violence and instability. To achieve lasting peace, closed-door meetings alone can't be the answer. What ordinary people think about peace agreements, the distribution of power, and truth commissions following settlements made after a conflict or war should also be taken into consideration.
Almost any peace process now, at some point, you're going to need a degree of democratic validation, meaning it could be a referendum, it could be a legislative agreement, law, or it could be a constitutional amendment. But at some point, you're going to need to have a degree of inclusivity. Agreements no longer can just be conducted behind closed doors by a few men who stitch up an agreement on a ceasefire and a political arrangement. There is a time and a place for behind-the-scenes, closed-door meetings in which the leaderships, as much as you can call them leaderships, of the different groups can work outside the limelight. But there's another time in a process which is absolutely critical, and before the agreement, where there is more inclusivity of the different constituencies that are affected by the conflict, that have a stake in the conflict, and that need to have a say in how the conflict is resolved. And I think it's critical, not just for getting to the agreement, but also for sustaining it. And while I think we could all, in many cases, show up on the White House lawn and bring the leadership together and get them to shake hands, to really sustain an agreement, it calls for having a more inclusive type of process. And I think this is in particular added value of non-state actors, both those at the global stage, but also very much at the conflict on the ground stage.